November 10, 1944, Camp Livingston, Louisiana. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the prisoner of war facility just as the sun began its descent below the pine trees. Inside the covered bed, 43 German women sat in silence, their faces pale and drawn from weeks of travel across the Atlantic and then by rail through the American South. They wore the remnants of gray auxiliary uniforms, some torn and stained from their capture in France, others still bearing the insignia of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps. These were not the prisoners Camp Livingston had been expecting. Major Thomas Fletcher stood at the gate, squinting at the manifest in his hand. His facility had housed thousands of German and Italian male prisoners since 1943, but never women. The notification from the War Department had arrived only 3 days earlier, giving him barely enough time to prepare a separate compound within the larger camp. He watched as the truck came to a stop, its brakes hissing in the humid Louisiana air. The women who emerged looked nothing like the enemy combatants he had processed before. They ranged in age from 18 to perhaps 35, their movements careful and uncertain. Many clutched small bags containing whatever possessions they had managed to keep through their capture and transport. Major Fletcher noticed how thin they were, how their uniforms hung loosely on frames that had clearly known prolonged hunger. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Hoffman, a former radio operator from Dresden. She stepped down from the truck and immediately felt the oppressive heat of the Louisiana autumn, so different from the cold November she had known in Europe. Her dark eyes scanned the unfamiliar landscape of wooden barracks, guard towers, and endless rows of barbed wire. Behind her, a younger woman named Elsa Braun stumbled slightly, weak from the journey. Greta reached out to steady her, their shared glance communicating the fear they both felt. The American Guard seemed uncertain how to treat these unexpected arrivals. Private Daniel Martinez, whose family ran a small farm in Texas, had been assigned to the women's compound. He watched as they formed into ragged lines, their military training still evident despite their obvious exhaustion. One woman, barely more than a girl, began to sway on her feet. Martinez moved forward instinctively, offering his arm for support, but she recoiled from his touch, her eyes wide with fear. Major Fletcher began the processing with formal efficiency, explaining through an interpreter the camp rules and expectations. The women would be housed in a separate section, guarded by both male and female personnel. They would be expected to work as all prisoners did, but their tasks would be appropriate to their capabilities. They would receive the same rations as other prisoners, prepared according to Geneva Convention standards. As the interpreter translated these words into German, Greta noticed something in the major's tone that surprised her. There was no cruelty there, no hatred. Just a tired officer doing his duty with as much humanity as wartime allowed. It was the first small seed of doubt about everything she had been taught to believe about Americans. The women's compound consisted of 4 wooden barracks arranged in a square, surrounded by its own fence within the larger camp perimeter. The structures were basic but clean, each equipped with rows of metal bunks, thin mattresses, and rough wool blankets. As the German women entered their assigned quarters that first evening, they moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers, claiming beds without conversation, unpacking their meager belongings in silence. Greta chose a lower bunk near the window where she could see a slice of sky beyond the barbed wire. Elsa took the bunk above her, and soon they were joined by 2 other women. Anna Schmidt, a former nurse from Munich, settled across from them with quiet dignity. Beside her, 20-year-old Margaret Klein clutched a small photograph of her family, her fingers trembling as she tucked it under her pillow. That night, whispered conversations in German filled the darkness. The women shared fragments of their stories, piecing together how they had all ended up in this strange place. Most had been captured during the Allied advance through France. Some had been administrative workers, others nurses or communication specialists. A few had been caught simply because they were in the wrong place when German forces retreated. The fear was palpable. They had heard stories about what happened to prisoners, particularly women prisoners, in enemy hands. The propaganda they had been fed for years painted Americans as barbaric, ruthless, concerned only with revenge. Yet the reality of their first hours seemed to contradict those teachings. The guards had been distant but not cruel. The barracks, while sparse, were weatherproof and clean. No one had struck them or shouted at them. Morning came early with the sound of a bell. The women rose stiffly, many having barely slept on the unfamiliar bunks. They were led to a washing facility where cold water flowed from simple spigots. After months of travel and detention, the opportunity to clean themselves felt like an unexpected luxury, even in the November chill. Breakfast was served in a mess hall that had been partitioned to separate them from the male prisoners. The women filed in, their eyes downcast, expecting the worst. What they received was a tin plate with oatmeal, a slice of bread, and weak coffee. It was simple fare, institutional and bland, but it was warm, and there was enough of it. For women who had spent the final months of the war in Europe watching rations dwindle to almost nothing, this simple breakfast seemed impossibly generous. Private Martinez stood watch as they ate, noting how slowly and carefully they consumed the food, how nothing was wasted. One of the older women began to cry quietly, tears falling into her oatmeal. When another prisoner asked her in German what was wrong, she whispered that she had not seen this much food at one time in over a year. The Americans watching had no idea that they had already begun to challenge everything these women believed about their enemy. The routine of camp life established itself quickly over the following days. The German women were assigned to light work duties, primarily in the camp laundry and kitchen preparation areas. They worked in silence, efficient and meticulous, their military training evident in how they approached even mundane tasks. But the American staff began to notice things that troubled them. Sergeant Rebecca Walsh, one of the few female personnel assigned to oversee the women's compound, observed how the prisoners hoarded food. After meals, she would find crusts of bread hidden in pockets, portions of vegetables wrapped in cloth and secreted away. At first, she assumed this was standard prisoner behavior, planning for potential shortages, but as she watched more carefully, she realized it was something deeper. These women had known real starvation. Greta had developed a system with her bunkmates. Any food that could be saved was carefully preserved and hidden in their footlockers. They rationed it among themselves, eating the saved portions late at night when hunger kept them awake. It was a habit formed during the final terrible months in Europe, when supply lines had collapsed and even military personnel had gone days without adequate food. The abundance in the American camp seemed too good to be true, too unstable to rely upon. The younger women showed the most visible signs of malnutrition. Margaret's clothes hung on her frame like a child wearing adult clothing. Her cheekbones stood out sharply, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Anna, with her nursing background, worried about several of the women who showed symptoms of vitamin deficiencies and anemia. She had tried to request medical attention through the interpreter, but her limited English and fear of drawing attention made communication difficult. Private Martinez noticed Elsa struggling to carry a basket of laundry that should not have been beyond the strength of a healthy woman in her early 20s. When he moved to help, she flinched away, but not before he saw how her hands trembled with weakness. That evening, he mentioned his observations to Sergeant Walsh. "These women are starving," he said bluntly. "Whatever they've been through, they're not getting enough food here to recover from it." Sergeant Walsh brought the concern to Major Fletcher, who immediately ordered the camp doctor to examine the women. Dr. Samuel Brennan, a veteran of the North African campaign, had seen malnourishment before, but even he was shocked by what he found. More than half the women were significantly underweight. Several showed signs of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Their bodies were consuming themselves, and while the standard prisoner rations were adequate for healthy individuals, these women needed more to recover. The examination marked a turning point in how the camp staff viewed their unexpected charges. These were not simply enemy prisoners to be detained until repatriation. They were human beings who had suffered, who needed care beyond the minimum requirements of international law. Dr. Brennan submitted his report with recommendations that went beyond standard medical protocol. He suggested supplemental rations, vitamin supplements, and a gradual increase in food portions to avoid refeeding syndrome. Major Fletcher approved the recommendations immediately, but he went further. If these women had been starving, then they deserved more than clinical medical intervention. They deserved dignity. The changes began small. Instead of the standard prisoner rations, the women's meals were quietly increased. Fresh vegetables appeared on their plates. Portions of meat grew slightly larger. Milk, a luxury they had not seen in years, was added to their breakfast routine. The women noticed immediately, their eyes widening at each meal, but they said nothing, as if speaking might break the spell. Sergeant Walsh took it upon herself to address the hoarding behavior directly. Through the interpreter, she gathered the women one evening and spoke to them plainly. "You do not need to hide food anymore," she said. "There will be enough tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day you are here. This is not a trick. This is how we feed people in America." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Greta, who had emerged as an unofficial leader among the prisoners, spoke up in halting English. "In Germany, they told us Americans would starve prisoners, that you hate us and want us to suffer." Sergeant Walsh felt a flash of anger, not at the woman before her, but at the propaganda that had so thoroughly deceived these people. "We don't hate you," she replied firmly. "You're prisoners, yes, but you're still human beings. That matters here." Trust did not come overnight, but small gestures began to build bridges. Private Martinez, noticing that Margaret looked particularly frail, brought her an extra apple from the guard's mess, offering it with a shy smile. She took it hesitantly, tears welling in her eyes at the simple kindness. Anna, working in the kitchen one day, accidentally burned her hand on a hot pot. Instead of ignoring her pain, the American cook, Corporal James Washington, immediately took her to the medical station, staying with her while Dr. Brennan treated the burn. These acts of casual humanity confused the German women more than cruelty would have. They had been prepared for hatred, for revenge, for the confirmation of every terrible thing they had been taught about their enemies. Instead, they were encountering something far more dangerous to their previous beliefs: ordinary kindness from ordinary people who simply treated suffering as something to be alleviated, regardless of nationality. Elsa confided to Greta one night that she no longer knew what to think. If Americans are supposed to be monsters, why do they care if we're hungry? Why does that doctor look at us with concern instead of contempt? Greta had no answers, only her own growing confusion about everything she had once believed without question. November 20th, 1944. The calendar marked exactly 10 days since the German women had arrived at Camp Livingston. Major Fletcher called an assembly in the women's compound, his presence signaling that something important was about to happen. The 43 women gathered in the common area between their barracks, their faces reflecting curiosity mixed with apprehension. Announcements in prison camps rarely brought good news. Through the interpreter, Major Fletcher explained that the fourth Thursday of November was an important American holiday called Thanksgiving. It was a day when Americans gathered with family to express gratitude and share an abundant meal together. This year, Thanksgiving would fall on November 23rd, just 3 days away. The major paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. He explained that the camp command had decided to include the women prisoners in the traditional Thanksgiving dinner, providing them with the same meal that would be served to American personnel. The interpreter's translation was met with confused silence. The women exchanged glances, unsure they had understood correctly. Greta raised her hand tentatively before speaking in her careful English. "We will eat the same food as American soldiers?" Major Fletcher nodded. "The same food? Yes, it's a tradition here. On Thanksgiving, Everyone at this camp, regardless of who they are, gets a proper holiday meal. The announcement sparked hushed conversations in German throughout the rest of the day. The women could not comprehend why their captors would share a special celebration with prisoners. In their experience, holidays in military service had meant perhaps slightly better rations, but nothing approaching what the major had described. Some suspected it was propaganda, a show for Red Cross inspectors. Others wondered if it was a cruel joke, a promise that would not be kept. Anna, with her practical nurse's mindset, tried to manage expectations among the younger women. "Do not hope for too much," she cautioned. "Perhaps they will give us extra bread and soup. That would already be generous." But even she could not entirely suppress the small spark of anticipation that had been lit by the major's words. Sergeant Walsh observed the women's reactions with sympathy. She understood their skepticism. These women had been taught that Americans were their enemies, that they could expect nothing but harsh treatment in captivity. The idea that they would be included in a cherished national holiday seemed to contradict everything their propaganda had told them. Private Martinez was assigned to help with preparations in the camp kitchen, and he witnessed firsthand the scale of the meal being planned. Turkeys were being thawed, potatoes delivered by the sack, canned vegetables stacked in preparation. The camp cooks, led by Corporal Washington, approached the task with the seriousness of a military operation. This wasn't just about feeding people. It was about upholding a tradition that spoke to something fundamental about American identity. The 3 days between the announcement and Thanksgiving moved slowly for everyone. The German women continued their work duties, but their thoughts kept returning to what might await them. They had no framework for understanding this kind of gesture from an enemy, no experience that prepared them for the possibility that their captors might treat them with such unexpected generosity. The camp kitchen became a hub of intense activity as Thanksgiving approached. Corporal Washington and his team of cooks worked from dawn until late evening, preparing food in quantities that seemed impossible to the German women who occasionally glimpsed the preparations. The aroma of roasting turkey began to drift across the compound 2 days before the holiday, a smell so rich and enticing that it made mouths water and stomachs ache with anticipation. Anna had been assigned to help with vegetable preparation, a task that put her directly in the kitchen alongside the American cooks. She watched in amazement as sack after sack of potatoes was delivered, along with cases of canned green beans, boxes of bread, and ingredients she did not even recognize. Corporal Washington, noticing her wide-eyed observation, smiled and explained through gestures and simple English what each item would become. The scale of abundance was incomprehensible to women who had spent the last year watching Germany's food supplies dwindle to almost nothing. Anna tried to count, the turkeys being prepared, and lost track after 20. Each bird was enormous, nothing like the scrawny chickens that had occasionally appeared in military rations back home. She reported what she had seen to her fellow prisoners that evening, but some refused to believe her. "No one feeds prisoners like that," Margaret insisted. "You must have misunderstood." But the evidence continued to mount. The mess hall was being decorated with autumn leaves and handmade paper decorations. Long tables were being arranged in rows instead of the usual scattered arrangement. Private Martinez and other guards worked alongside prisoners to set up additional seating, treating the preparation as a shared project rather than forced labor. The atmosphere felt different, less like a detention facility and more like a community preparing for something special. Greta found herself assigned to help fold napkins and arrange place settings, a task that felt surreally domestic. An older American soldier, Corporal Henry Miller, worked beside her, demonstrating how the Americans preferred their tables arranged. He showed her pictures of his family's Thanksgiving celebrations back in Ohio, trying to explain through broken communication what the holiday meant to him. "It's about being grateful," he said slowly, making sure she understood. Grateful for food, for family, for being alive. Even in hard times, there's always something to be thankful for. The concept struck Greta deeply. Gratitude seemed like a luxury she had not considered in months. Since her capture, survival had been her only focus. Before that, serving the Reich had consumed her thoughts. But gratitude? When had she last taken time to feel truly thankful for anything? The question unsettled her in ways she could not fully articulate. Sergeant Walsh conducted an inspection of the women's barracks the evening before Thanksgiving, not looking for contraband, but ensuring everyone had clean clothing to wear for the next day's meal. She had quietly arranged for additional uniform pieces to be issued to women whose clothes were too worn or damaged. It was a small gesture, but it communicated something important. This meal would be an event worthy of one's best appearance, and that included the prisoners. November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day arrived with crisp autumn weather, unusual for Louisiana, but welcome after weeks of humidity. The German women rose early, anxiety and anticipation making sleep impossible. They dressed in their cleanest uniforms, helped each other smooth down hair and straighten collars. The atmosphere in the barracks felt like preparation for an inspection, but underneath the nervous energy ran something else. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. At 1100 hours, the women were assembled and led toward the main mess hall. As they approached, the smell of roasted meat and baked bread grew stronger, so rich and overwhelming that several women felt dizzy. They entered the building in a quiet line, their eyes adjusting from the bright November sunlight to the dimmer interior. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. The mess hall had been transformed. Long tables stretched the length of the room covered with white cloths. Place settings had been arranged with care, each spot marked with a plate, utensils, a napkin, and a cup. But it was not the decoration that struck them silent, it was the food. Platters of sliced turkey, golden brown and glistening, sat at intervals along every table. Bowls of mashed potatoes, their surfaces smooth and topped with melting butter, steamed in the cool air. Green beans, glazed carrots, stuffing, cranberry sauce in deep red mounds, baskets of fresh bread, and at the end of each table, whole pies with latticed crusts. Margaret made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. Beside her, Elsa reached out to grip the doorframe for support, her legs suddenly weak. Greta felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. This was not prison food. This was not even military rations. This was abundance beyond anything they had seen in years. Food in quantities that seemed wasteful, impossible, almost obscene in its generosity. The American soldiers were already seated at some tables, but they had left the best positions for the German women. Major Fletcher stood at the front of the hall and gestured for the prisoners to take their seats. His voice carried across the sudden silence. Today, we share a meal, as Americans have done for hundreds of years. Today, we give thanks for what we have, and we share it with everyone at this table. Please sit. The women moved forward hesitantly, still unable to fully believe what they were seeing. Anna found herself seated between Private Martinez and another young American soldier. Across from her, Greta sat with trembling hands clasped in her lap, staring at the empty plate before her as if it might disappear. Elsa had begun to cry openly, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the abundance surrounding her. Corporal Washington and his kitchen staff began to serve, moving along the tables with platters and bowls. When the first portion of turkey was placed on Anna's plate, thick slices of white and dark meat, she stared at it in disbelief. Then came mashed potatoes, a generous scoop that covered a quarter of her plate. Green beans followed, then stuffing, then a spoonful of cranberry sauce. The serving continued until every plate held more food than most of the German women had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. The portions were not meager prisoner rations, carefully measured for minimum sustenance. They were generous, abundant, the kind of serving one might give to honored guests. The women stared at their plates in stunned silence, unable to process what sat before them. Margaret whispered in German to the woman beside her, asking if this was real. Her voice cracked with emotion as she reached out tentatively to touch the mashed potatoes as if they might vanish under her fingertips. The warmth of the food, the reality of it, brought fresh tears to her eyes. Around the hall, similar scenes were unfolding as German women confronted abundance they had been told did not exist in America. Major Fletcher stood and raised his cup. In keeping with tradition, he said, "I want to express gratitude for this meal, for the men and women serving here, and for the hope that one day this war will end and we can all return to our families." The interpreter translated his words, and several of the German women nodded, their own thoughts turning to distant homes and uncertain futures. Then, Corporal Washington, standing near the kitchen entrance, called out in his deep voice, "Dig in, everyone. Don't let it get cold." The American soldiers began to eat, the casual normalcy of their actions giving the German women permission to do the same. But picking up a fork felt like crossing a monoan, invisible threshold, accepting something they did not fully understand. Greta cut a small piece of turkey, her hands shaking as she brought it to her mouth. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs, moist and flavorful in ways she had almost forgotten food could be. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing as taste and memory collided. This was food prepared with care, with skill, with the assumption that the people eating it deserved something good. She had not felt deserving of anything in so long that the simple act of eating well felt like forgiveness she had not earned. Anna tried the mashed potatoes next, creamy and rich with butter, and found herself unable to stop the tears that began to fall. She was not alone. Throughout the hall, German women were crying as they ate, overwhelmed by flavors they had nearly forgotten existed, by the sheer abundance of what had been given to them, by the contradiction between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. Private Martinez, sitting beside Anna, noticed her tears and felt his own eyes sting with sympathy. He wanted to say something comforting, but did not know if she would understand his English or trust his intentions. Instead, he simply passed her the basket of bread, a small gesture of shared humanity that needed no translation. She took a piece with a trembling thank you, one of the few English phrases she had learned. The meal continued in relative quiet, the usual boisterous atmosphere of a military dining hall subdued by the emotional weight of the moment. American soldiers watched their former enemies experience something that seemed to break through barriers stronger than barbed wire or guard towers. As the initial shock of the meal subsided and plates began to empty, something unexpected happened. Conversation started, tentative at first, then growing more natural as food worked its ancient magic of bringing people together. Private Martinez attempted to explain to Anna what each dish was called, pointing and speaking slowly. "Turkey," he said, gesturing to the meat. "Thanksgiving turkey." Anna repeated the word carefully, her accent thick, but her effort genuine. Across the table, Corporal Miller was showing Greta photographs from his wallet, pictures of his wife and 2 young daughters back in Ohio. He pointed to the image of a table laden with food, similar to what surrounded them now. "Thanksgiving," he explained. "Every year, my family." He gestured around the mess hall. "Like this, but home." Greta studied the photographs, seeing in them a life that seemed impossibly distant from her current reality. "Your daughters," she said in halting English. "Very beautiful." The simple exchange opened a floodgate. Other soldiers began sharing their own Thanksgiving memories, using gestures and simple words to bridge the language barrier. They spoke of grandmothers who cooked for days, of family arguments over who made the best pie, of traditions passed down through generations. The German women listened with fascination, glimpsing through these stories a vision of American life that contradicted everything their propaganda had taught them. Sergeant Walsh sat with a group of younger German women, including Elsa and Margaret. She had brought a small album of photographs from previous Thanksgivings at various military posts where she had served. The images showed soldiers gathered around tables much like this one, smiling and relaxed. the camaraderie of shared meals evident even in still photographs. "This is what we do," Walsh explained through the interpreter. "Even in war, we remember to be grateful, to share what we have." Elsa surprised everyone by pulling from her pocket a small, worn photograph of her own family. It showed a formal portrait, her parents and younger siblings dressed in their best clothes, taken before the war had shattered their world. Her voice was soft as she spoke in German, the interpreter translating. "This was my family's Christmas. 1941, the last time we were all together." Walsh looked at the image and saw not an enemy, but a young woman mourning a lost life, no different from countless American soldiers who carried similar photographs and similar grief. The sharing of stories created unexpected connections. The women learned that Corporal Washington had grown up poor in Mississippi, that Thanksgiving meals in his childhood had been modest affairs, nothing like the abundance spread before them now. He had joined the Army partly for the steady meals, he admitted, with a self-deprecating laugh. "Never thought I would end up cooking for hundreds of people, but here we are." His honesty about his own humble origins surprised the German women, who had been taught that all Americans lived in luxury and excess. Private Martinez spoke about his family's small farm in Texas, about the hard work of coaxing crops from difficult soil, about the pride his parents had taken in providing for their children even in lean years. He was not so different from many of the German women who came from working families, who understood what it meant to struggle and to value food because of that struggle. As the meal progressed and tongues loosened, with the comfort of full stomachs, the conversation took a more serious turn. Greta, emboldened by the genuine warmth she had experienced from the American soldiers, ventured a question that had been troubling her since her arrival. Through the interpreter, she asked Major Fletcher directly. "In Germany, they told us that America was starving, that your people had no food because you sent it all to Britain. They said Americans hated Germans and would treat prisoners with cruelty. Why did they tell us these lies?" The question hung in the air, more profound than perhaps Greta had intended. Major Fletcher considered his response carefully. "I cannot speak to why your leaders told you what they did," he said slowly, "but I can tell you that America has enough. Enough food, enough resources. We believe that even enemies deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. That is not weakness. That is who we are." The interpreter translated, and several German women nodded, their faces reflecting deep thought. Anna spoke up, her voice carrying across the now quiet hall. She addressed the group in German, which the interpreter then translated. "We were told that American soldiers were savages, that they showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. We were told to fear capture more than death. Yet, since we arrived here, we have been given food, shelter, medical care. We have been treated with more kindness than we received from our own officers in the final months of the war. How do we reconcile what we were taught with what we have experienced?" The question opened a flood of similar confessions from other German women. They had been taught that America was a nation of criminals and degenerates, morally corrupt and materially weak. They had been told that American soldiers were cowards who relied on superior numbers and equipment because they lacked the courage and discipline of German forces. They had been assured that German victory was inevitable, that American resolve would crumble under sustained pressure. Yet everything they had experienced since their capture contradicted these teachings. The American soldiers were not cowards, but ordinary young men doing their duty with a mixture of professionalism and compassion. The country was not starving, but possessed abundance beyond German imagination. The treatment they received was not cruel, but marked by an attention to dignity that had been absent from their own military experience. Corporal Washington spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. The interpreter worked to convey his southern drawl and cadence. "I imagine you were told what your leaders needed you to believe to keep you fighting their war. That's what propaganda does. It makes enemies into monsters so you don't see them as people. But here's the truth. Most Americans don't hate Germans. We hate what your country's government has done, the war it started, the suffering it caused. But you are just people caught up in something bigger than yourselves, just like us." His words struck deep. Several women began to cry again, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of recognition, of understanding that they had been deceived, that the worldview they had been given was built on lies. For young women who had believed they were serving a righteous cause, this realization was devastating in its implications. The Thanksgiving meal concluded with slices of pumpkin and apple pie, desserts so rich and sweet that they seemed like dreams made tangible. As the women savored these final courses, the reality of their situation settled over them with new weight. They had been given this remarkable experience, this glimpse into a world they had been taught did not exist, but they had no way to share it with anyone back home. The International Red Cross allowed prisoners to send brief, censored letters, but how could they possibly convey what they had experienced today? That evening, back in their barracks, many of the women attempted to write letters anyway, knowing that even if they were permitted to send them, the censors would likely remove any descriptions that contradicted official German propaganda. Greta sat on her bunk with a precious piece of paper and a stubby pencil, trying to find words that would pass inspection while still communicating something meaningful to her mother in Hamburg. She wrote about the weather, about being healthy and adequately fed, about the work duties she performed, but what she wanted to write, what burned in her chest to express, was the truth. She wanted to tell her mother that Americans had served her a feast on their national holiday, that they had included enemy prisoners in their celebration with genuine generosity. She wanted to describe the abundance, the kindness, the fundamental decency she had encountered. But such words would be censored, or worse, might bring suspicion upon her family for receiving a letter from a daughter who had clearly been corrupted by enemy influence. Anna faced a similar dilemma as she attempted to write to her younger sister. How could she explain that everything they had been taught about America was false? How could she convey that their enemies were treating her better than her own officers had in the final chaotic months before her capture? The enormity of the deception they had been subjected to felt overwhelming, and she found herself unable to write anything beyond bland assurances of her continued survival. Elsa gave up on writing entirely, too confused by her conflicting emotions to form coherent thoughts. Instead, she spoke quietly with Margaret about what the day had meant. "I do not know who I am anymore," she confessed. "I believed I was serving Germany, protecting our key homeland. But if they lied to us about America, what else did they lie about? What were we really serving?" The questions had no easy answers, but asking them was itself a form of awakening. Sergeant Walsh made her evening rounds and found the barracks unusually subdued. The women sat in small groups, talking in hushed German, their faces reflecting deep contemplation rather than the resigned depression that had characterized their first weeks in captivity. She understood, even without speaking their language, that something fundamental had shifted today. Food had accomplished what speeches and orders never could. It had opened minds to the possibility that the world was different than they had been told. Private Martinez, standing guard outside the women's compound, thought about the tears he had seen during the meal. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even joy, at receiving good food. But he had not anticipated the depth of emotion, the sense that these women were experiencing something that went far beyond a satisfying meal. The days following Thanksgiving brought a noticeable change in the atmosphere of the women's compound. The German prisoners seemed less guarded, more willing to engage with their American captors beyond the minimum required interactions. The meal had created a foundation of trust, fragile but real, upon which new relationships began to build. Language became both a barrier and a bridge, with women on both sides working to overcome the limitations of their communication. Greta took the initiative to ask Sergeant Walsh if English lessons might be possible. Her request, delivered in careful, halting English, surprised the sergeant but pleased her immensely. Within 2 days, Walsh had organized informal classes 3 evenings per week. Private Martinez volunteered to help, along with Corporal Miller, whose patience and gentle manner made him an effective teacher despite having no formal training in language instruction. The first lesson drew nearly 30 of the 43 women. They sat on benches in the common area, notebook paper and pencils distributed by the guards, their faces showing a mixture of nervousness and determination. Sergeant Walsh began with simple phrases. "Hello, how are you? Thank you, please, yes and no." The women repeated the words in chorus, their German accents thick, but their effort genuine. When Margaret successfully asked Private Martinez for water in English, the entire group applauded her accomplishment. Anna, with her nursing background, focused on learning medical terminology. She worked with Dr. Brennan during her infirmary duties, pointing to items and asking for their English names: bandage, thermometer, medicine, blood pressure. The doctor recognized her intelligence and dedication, often spending extra time teaching her not just vocabulary but proper medical procedures. "She learns faster than some of my own corpsmen," he remarked to Major Fletcher. "She has real talent for this work." The language lessons created unexpected moments of humor that helped ease tensions. When Elsa tried to say she was tired but accidentally used a word that meant she was tight, the resulting confusion and laughter broke down walls more effectively than any formal protocol could have. The Americans shared their own struggles with German phrases, mangling pronunciation so badly that even the most reserved German women could not help but smile. Corporal Washington taught food-related vocabulary during kitchen duties, holding up items and saying their names while the women repeated after him. Potato, carrot, onion, bread, chicken. The lessons were practical and immediate, giving the women words they could use in their daily work. More importantly, they transformed routine tasks into opportunities for connection. When Anna could ask for the knife in English instead of gesturing, both she and the American cooks felt a small victory. These language exchanges revealed personalities that had been hidden behind the formality of enemy status. The Americans discovered that Greta had a sharp wit, that Elsa loved to sing, that Margaret could draw beautiful sketches. The German women learned that Private Martinez missed his girlfriend terribly, that Sergeant Walsh had wanted to be a teacher before the war, that Corporal Miller could tell jokes that transcended language barriers through physical comedy alone. They were becoming, slowly but unmistakably, not just prisoners and guards, but people who knew each other. December brought colder weather and troubling news from Europe. Allied forces continued their advance into German territory, and reports began filtering back about what they were discovering. Major Fletcher received regular intelligence briefings, and the information he read disturbed him deeply. He faced a difficult decision about whether to share this information with the German women. They had a right to know what was being discovered in their homeland, yet the revelations would be devastating. After consulting with Dr. Brennan and Sergeant Walsh, Fletcher decided that truth, however painful, was preferable to allowing the women to remain ignorant. He called an assembly on December 8th and announced that American newspapers would be made available in the camp library, including those with reports from Germany. The women who could read English would be able to access information about the war's progress and conditions in their homeland. The interpreter would be available to help translate articles upon request. Greta was among the first to enter the library that afternoon. She had developed enough English reading comprehension to work through newspaper articles slowly, using a dictionary Walsh had provided. The first article she read described the discovery of labor camps in occupied Poland. The words were clinical, journalistic, but the implications were horrific. Systematic starvation, forced labor under brutal conditions, mass graves containing thousands of bodies. Her hands began to shake as she continued reading. Anna found her there an hour later, tears streaming down Greta's face as she stared at photographs that accompanied the articles. The images were grainy black and white, but clear enough to show skeletal figures behind barbed wire, piles of emaciated bodies, the infrastructure of industrial-scale death. Anna sank into the chair beside her, and together they read in stunned silence, the interpreter, helping them understand passages that were beyond their English comprehension. Other women gathered as words spread through the compound. The articles described camps with names they had never heard: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Treblinka. The reports detailed systematic murder of Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The scale of it was incomprehensible. Not hundreds or even thousands, but millions of people killed in organized, bureaucratic fashion. This was not collateral damage from war. This was planned extermination. The German women's reactions ranged from disbelief to horror to desperate denial. Some insisted the reports must be Allied propaganda, exaggerations designed to justify the war against Germany. But others, confronted with photographs and eyewitness accounts from multiple sources, could not sustain that denial. They had to face the possibility that they had served a regime engaged in crimes beyond imagination, that the uniform they had worn represented something monstrous. Margaret became physically ill, vomiting in the latrine as the full weight of the revelations hit her. She had believed she was serving her country's defense, protecting German homes and families from foreign aggression. Instead, she had been part of a system that murdered innocents on an unprecedented scale. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could both things be true? How could she have served evil while believing she served good? That evening, the barracks were silent except for muffled crying. Women lay in their bunks, grappling with information that shattered their understanding of themselves and their country. The weeks following the revelation about concentration camps brought profound soul-searching among the German women. They faced questions about complicity and responsibility that had no easy answers. Most had been low-ranking auxiliary personnel, far from decision-making power, but they had worn the uniform and contributed to the war effort. Did ignorance absolve them? Did good intentions matter when the cause they served was evil? Major Fletcher observed their struggle with sympathy tempered by justice. These women clearly had not known about the death camps, had not participated directly in atrocities, but they had been part of the machinery that made such horrors possible. He consulted with Chaplain Captain Robert Morrison about how to address their moral crisis. The chaplain, a thoughtful man who had studied theology before the war, suggested allowing the women access to religious services and counseling if they wished. Several women, including Anna and Margaret, began attending the Sunday Protestant services held in the camp chapel. Father Michael O'Brien, the Catholic chaplain, offered to hear confessions from anyone who desired it, regardless of their denomination. The need to confess, to articulate guilt and seek some form of absolution became overwhelming for many of the women. They had carried so much without realizing its weight, and now the burden threatened to crush them. Greta struggled differently. She was not particularly religious and found no comfort in prayer or confession. Instead, she turned to Sergeant Walsh, asking through her improving English if they could talk privately. Walsh agreed, and they sat together in the library one evening while Greta tried to articulate her turmoil. "I thought I was a good person," Greta said, her voice breaking. "I joined the women's auxiliary corps because I believed Germany needed defending. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I helped them. Even if I did not know, I helped them do these terrible things." Walsh listened without offering easy platitudes. "You cannot change what you did when you did not know better," she finally said. "But you can choose what you do now that you do know. That is what defines you, not your past ignorance, but your present choices." The words offered no absolution, but provided a framework for moving forward. Responsibility without paralysis, acknowledgement without self-destruction. Meanwhile, discussions among the women about their eventual return to Germany took on new urgency and complexity. Repatriation would likely occur within months as the war in Europe drew toward its inevitable conclusion. But what would they be returning to? Germany was being destroyed, its cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, its armies in retreat on all fronts. More troubling, what kind of reception would they receive as women who had been captured and held by the Americans? Elsa voiced the fear many shared during a quiet conversation in the barracks. They will say we were corrupted by the enemy, that we betrayed Germany by accepting kindness from Americans. They will not want to hear that we were treated well, that we learned their propaganda was lies. It would challenge everything they still believe. The prediction was probably accurate. The women who returned would face suspicion and hostility, perhaps worse. But staying was not an option. They were prisoners of war, subject to repatriation under international law. America was not their home and could never be, regardless of how well they had been treated. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, an unexpected development began to change the trajectory of the women's futures. Local families from nearby communities, having heard about the German prisoners through church networks and newspaper articles, began to reach out to camp authorities. They offered to host small groups of women for Christmas Day, wanting to share the holiday with people far from home. Major Fletcher was initially skeptical, concerned about security and the potential for incidents, but the sincerity of the offers moved him. After careful screening and consultation with his superiors, Fletcher approved a limited program. 10 women, chosen for their good conduct and improving English skills, would be allowed to spend Christmas afternoon and evening with local families under light guard supervision. The announcement created tremendous excitement and anxiety among the prisoners. Greta, Anna, Elsa, and Margaret were all selected, along with 6 others who had shown positive adjustment to camp life. The Henderson family, owners of a small farm outside Alexandria, Louisiana, requested to host 3 women. Edward and Martha Henderson had 2 sons serving in Europe and felt compelled to show kindness to young women who reminded them of the hardships their own boys might be facing. When they arrived at camp on Christmas morning to collect their guests, Martha Henderson embraced each woman gently, her maternal warmth immediately putting them at ease. The drive to the Henderson farm took 20 minutes through Louisiana countryside. The German women stared out the windows at the landscape, so different from anything they had known in Europe. Even in December, vegetation remained green. Farmhouses dotted the rolling land, most modest but well-maintained. There was no visible war damage, no ruins, no evidence of the devastation that had become normal in Germany. The absence of destruction was itself remarkable. The Henderson home was a white wooden farmhouse, simple but comfortable, with a wide porch and large windows. Inside, the smell of baking ham and sweet potatoes filled the air. Martha had prepared a Christmas dinner that, while not as elaborate as the Thanksgiving feast, was generous and lovingly made. The table was set with her good china, fresh flowers arranged in a vase at the center. She had made the women feel not like prisoners on supervised leave, but like honored guests. During the meal, the Hendersons asked about the women's families, their lives before the war, their hopes for the future. The questions were gentle, genuinely curious rather than interrogating. Greta found herself talking about her childhood in Dresden, about her father's bookshop and her mother's garden. Anna described her nursing training, her desire to heal people, how that calling had led her to join the military medical corps. Margaret showed them her sketches, drawings she had made in the camp of birds and flowers, her artistic talent evident despite limited materials. Edward Henderson brought out a map and asked the women to show him where they were from in Germany. As they pointed to their hometowns, his expression grew somber. Many of these cities had been heavily bombed by Allied forces. The women knew this, but seeing recognition in Edward's eyes brought the reality home anew. "I am sorry for what your families are enduring," he said quietly. The Christmas visits with local families planted seeds that would grow into something unexpected. The Henderson family, deeply moved by their time with Greta, Anna, and Margaret, began corresponding with Major Fletcher about a remarkable possibility. They wanted to sponsor one of the women for immigration to the United States after the war. The idea was unprecedented, controversial, and legally complex, but it represented a genuinely American impulse toward redemption and second chances. Other families who had hosted German women made similar inquiries. The Caldwell family wanted to help Elsa, whose artistic talent and gentle nature had touched them deeply. The Robinsons, an older couple whose son had died at Normandy, found in Anna a daughter figure who reminded them that even enemies were human beings deserving of compassion. These families recognized that the young women they had met were not ideological Nazis, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Major Fletcher forwarded these requests to the War Department with his own recommendation for consideration. He noted the women's genuine transformation, their remorse upon learning about their country's crimes, and their positive contributions to camp life. He argued that allowing some to remain in America would demonstrate the nation's commitment to its founding principles of offering refuge and opportunity to those willing to embrace American values. The response from Washington was cautiously optimistic. While mass immigration of former enemy nationals was impossible, individual cases might be considered after the war's conclusion, particularly for those with American sponsors willing to guarantee employment and housing. The women would need to renounce any allegiance to the Nazi regime, demonstrate English proficiency, and show evidence of successful integration into American society. It was a narrow path, but it was a path. When Major Fletcher shared this information with the women in January 1945, the reaction was mixed. Some felt overwhelming gratitude for the possibility of a future in America. Others struggled with the idea of abandoning Germany entirely, feeling that doing so would be a final betrayal of their homeland. The choice was not simple, not purely practical. It involved fundamental questions of identity, loyalty, and what it meant to belong somewhere. Greta spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. The Henderson family had explicitly offered to sponsor her, promising help with education and employment. They saw potential in her intelligence and language skills, believed she could build a meaningful life in Louisiana. But accepting meant acknowledging that she could never truly go home, that the Germany she had known no longer existed and might never exist again. It meant choosing a new identity, becoming something other than what she had been. Anna faced similar turmoil. Dr. Brennan had offered to help her complete nursing certification in America, providing a path to the profession she had always desired. The opportunity was extraordinary, far beyond what she could expect in devastated post-war Germany. But her family was there, her younger sister, who she had not heard from in over a year. How could she abandon them to pursue her own future in a foreign land? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the world for nearly 6 years was finally over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and across America, celebrations erupted in streets and town squares. At Camp Livingston, the mood was jubilant among American personnel, but deeply complicated for the German prisoners. Their country had been defeated, their world irrevocably changed, and now they faced decisions about futures that seemed impossibly uncertain. Repatriation. Procedures began immediately for most German prisoners across the United States. Transport ships were being organized to return tens of thousands of men and women to occupied Germany. The process would take months, but the machinery of demobilization was already in motion. For the women at Camp Livingston, this meant confronting the choice they had been contemplating for weeks: return to Germany or attempt to remain in America through the sponsorship program. Major Fletcher called a final assembly to explain the options clearly. Those who wished to return to Germany would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to their home regions. Those who wished to pursue immigration would need to complete extensive paperwork, undergo additional interviews, and wait for approval that might never come. There were no guarantees, no promises that sponsorship would be sufficient. The safer, simpler choice was repatriation. Of the 43 women who had arrived at Camp Livingston 6 months earlier, 28 chose to return to Germany despite the uncertainties they would face there. They had families to find, responsibilities to fulfill, a sense that their duty lay in helping rebuild their shattered homeland. Their decision commanded respect. They were choosing the harder path, the one that required facing consequences and contributing to recovery rather than escaping to easier circumstances elsewhere. But 15 women, led by Greta and Anna, made the agonizing choice to stay. They submitted applications for immigration, accepted sponsorships from American families, and began the long process of transforming from enemy prisoners to potential citizens. The decision brought guilt alongside hope. Were they abandoning Germany in its darkest hour? Were they betraying families who needed them? Or were they choosing to live according to values they had discovered during captivity, values of human dignity and second chances? Elsa wrote a letter to her mother, not knowing if it would ever be delivered, explaining her decision. She described the kindness she had received, the education she was pursuing, the opportunity to become something more than she had been. She expressed love and longing, but also determination to build a life that honored what she had learned about herself and the world. Whether her mother would understand or forgive, she could not know. The women who chose to stay were transferred to a different facility, no longer classified as prisoners of war, but as applicants for immigration status. The change in legal designation felt momentous. They were no longer enemies, but people in transition, suspended between old identities and new possibilities. Sergeant Walsh accompanied them to the new location, having requested transfer to continue working with women she had come to admire deeply. 30 years later, November 1975. Greta Henderson stood in her kitchen in Alexandria, Louisiana, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for her extended family. Her hands, now weathered by 3 decades of work and life, moved with practiced efficiency as she basted a turkey identical to the one she had first encountered on that transformative day in 1944. Beside her, her daughter Sarah, age 23, mashed potatoes, while sharing stories about her medical school experiences. Her son Edward, named after the man who had sponsored Greta's immigration, set the table with the same care his mother had been taught so many years ago. The Henderson family home, larger now than the modest farmhouse where Greta had spent that first American Christmas, would soon fill with people representing the life she had built. Martha and Edward Henderson, elderly but still vibrant, would arrive with their grandchildren. Anna Weber, now Dr. Anna Weber, would drive from Baton Rouge, where she directed nursing education at a major hospital. Elsa Caldwell would come with her husband and 3 children, her artwork hanging in galleries across the South. Margaret Simmons would join them, her career as an art teacher having touched hundreds of Louisiana students. Every Thanksgiving since 1946, these 4 women had gathered to remember and celebrate the meal that had changed their lives. It had become their private tradition, a ritual of gratitude that went deeper than the American holiday itself. They gathered not just to give thanks for abundance, but to honor the moment when they had first understood that enemies could become friends, that hatred could transform into understanding, that people could choose to become better than their circumstances suggested. As guests arrived and the house filled with conversation and laughter, Greta took a moment to step outside onto the porch. She looked across the Louisiana landscape, so familiar now after 3 decades, yet still capable of surprising her with its difference from the Germany she dimly remembered. She thought about the young woman she had been, frightened and confused, arriving at an American prison camp, expecting cruelty and finding compassion instead. That girl seemed like a stranger now, Yet Greta carried her memory with tenderness, understanding that transformation required honoring both who you were and who you chose to become. Inside, Martha Henderson raised her glass for the traditional toast. 31 years ago, she said, her voice strong despite her age, strangers became family across the divide of war. We learned that the best of America is not our wealth or power, but our willingness to see humanity in everyone, even those we are told to hate. Greta felt tears gather in her eyes, the same tears that had fallen so many years ago when she first saw a plate filled with abundance and realized that everything she had been taught was wrong. She had built a good life in America, contributed to her community, raised children who knew nothing of war and everything about opportunity. But she never forgot that it had all started with a simple act of generosity, with Americans who chose to feed their enemies and in doing so, transformed them into friends.